This is Sean Grinder, yada yada. Gabe Powers, and with me is Trucks of the Dams. I forget his name. Patrick Ripoll.
It is.
Say hi, quick.
Hi.
Okay, so this is part 3. We took a break. We recorded part 1 and 2, then we recorded part 1 again. So we took a couple days break, and now we're recording the final part of our shot on video mega episode.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to get right into
with
it.
Death Row Diner from 1988, directed by, and then you tell me what D3 is.
This guy has only ever done pornography after this. So I think he changed his name to a pseudonym because of that. He is credited as someone else on IMDb, but I did not write it down, so it don't matter. So we'll just call him D3. This is, I watched this one. It's actually okay. It's ambitious. It's a funny concept that a condemned studio executive who is later exonerated isn't given his last meal and freaks out, and he is killed before he gets it. And returns from the dead to haunt the set of a cheap horror movie that's being made by the studio bearing his name in the same prison 40 years later. And so he kills and chops up and eventually cooks the cast and crew to feed them to his granddaughter, who he thinks is his wife, because he's not aware that he's been dead for 40 years. It has a really strong opening that is black and white, which is definitely the best black and white shot on video footage I've seen. And it has this whole thing about him getting dragged to the electric chair, and they then cut to the present day, and it's in color, and they actually recycle the camera moves, but the actors are different this time, and then someone yells cut. So if you hadn't read the description, it really does sort of surprise you that it's a movie set. The jokes are usually either too obvious or racist, too nonsensical or too opaque to be funny. The one I wrote down, didn't write down any of the racist ones, but there's an early joke where there's a Paul Hogan Aussie actor who goes in to talk to this sleazy guy who's in charge of the studio currently, since this guy's been dead, and he thinks he's going in for an adventure movie, but it turns out they're actually trying him out for posing nude in a gay magazine, and he has a swastika tattoo for some reason. So I'm not really sure if this was was Paul Hogan in Playgirl or something. I didn't understand the gist of the joke, but then that guy never appears again, so it was definitely just a gag. I think that Crocodile Dundee had just come out, so maybe people are sick of Crocodile Dundee. Yeah, it's nicely shot. The makeup effects are really good. It feels like a trauma movie, one of the better trauma movies. The weird thing is that the same year it was released, there was a higher budget movie called The Destroyer, starring Anthony Perkins, as a filmmaker who goes to shoot a movie in an abandoned jail, and a condemned murderer who survived the electric chair reappears to murder the cast and crew of this cheap exploitation movie they're making.
Really?
And to the point where I actually started to think maybe I'd already seen this movie, and I finally realized that there are actual character types and dialogue situations that are so close that I admit, like the director is a bigger asshole in Death Row Diner, but the Anthony Perkins character is also a pretty big prick, as his only real character thing. And what's even funnier is that in 1989 there was a Wes Craven movie called Shocker about a serial killer who's kind of turned into a circuit surfing ghost when the electric chair malfunctions. And then also in 1989 there's a Sean Cunningham produced movie called The Horror Show, about a slasher. There was a slasher where a serial killer who becomes a vengeful ghost after being fried in the electric chair. So it was like a weird thing that happened between 88 and 89 where everybody had the same sort of electric chair failure turns you into a ghost.
Well, you have a better memory of this era than I do, me being only one and a half when this movie came out. Can you tell me what was there a capital punishment sort of thing that was boiling over in culture?
Yeah, I think so, because towards the end of Reagan's time in office, I think they brought back federal I want to say federal capital
Oh,
punishment.
Christ, yeah.
And so I think it was on everybody's mind.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this one's on YouTube like the rest of like many of them, and it if you can get past the racist parts, it's very short, which is also nice.
The next one is The Hackers from 1988, directed by John Duncan. It is sort of inspired, I believe, by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, though I've seen other reviews compare it to just being more of a typical slasher. One in particular said it was a bad version of Troma's Mother's Day, so that's not exactly a shining endorsement. But
no.
I think it was a sort of holy grail for the SOV collectors at a point, because it was rare. I think only 3,000 tapes were ever made, which I do wonder what the numbers are on these films, because I wonder how many got that much more tapes than 3,000. 3,000 seems, for some of these movies, seems like a whole lot, but I don't know.
I don't have much of a concept on how many major motion pictures. I mean, I suppose towards the end of the VHS era, major motion pictures you'd have like 20 per Blockbuster Video.
Right.
So there were probably hundreds of thousands at that point.
Right, but as like a baseline, like a prominent SOV movie like Video Violence or Sledgehammer, I wonder how many tapes were made of those.
Yeah, it couldn't have been that many. But I suppose 3,000 is a pretty small number for a production.
Yeah. Anyway, if you do find a copy on eBay for $2,000 or whatever, you probably shouldn't buy it, because apparently it's very unremarkable. The next one is Hollowgate from 1988, directed by Ray DiZazzo, which is a Halloween slasher, which kind of made me want to see it, but I didn't end up watching this, though it is on YouTube if you want to check out Hollowgate from 1988. Everything I read about it made it also seem like a very unremarkable slasher movie. It was produced, though, by Joseph Murray, who he directed a film we talked about in the last episode, The Newly Deads, and of course then he went on to do more famous things with his shot-on-video 90s action movies like Rage the Sweeper and Repo Jake, but we already talked about all that. The next one is called Hollywood's New Blood from 1988, directed by James Shyman. That's also available on YouTube if you want to check it out. It is a slasher movie where the location is an acting retreat in a cabin in the woods.
That's interesting. That's sort of the plot of Curtains, it's an acting retreat in a cabin in the woods. I wonder if they saw Curtains.
Yeah.
Just stole it.
I like the idea of retreats of any kind, of like this group of people already have problems and are already feeling a little awkward, and then someone starts murdering them all off. I kind of like that just as a horror premise in general. I guess this goes back to like me thinking Dream Warriors is like the best 80s horror movie ever. I like there being a conflict before the horror starts. And
I quite like Curtains personally, so maybe I should have watched this one, but I just didn't have the time.
The one note I wrote down from the reviews I read of it is that apparently the special effects are very bad. So.
Oh, okay. That doesn't really bother me.
Next was Shadows of Blood from 1988, directed by Cindy Ling. This is available on YouTube, and this is I'm sorry, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation here.
Stage name is Paul Naschy. Real name Juancito Molina Alvarez.
So Paul Naschy, as he is most known, was a Spanish sort of horror film star, and I've not seen any of his films, but you're pretty familiar with him.
Yeah, I figured I should watch this one since I'm kind of a fan. He was most famous for the Waldemar Daninsky / El Hombre Lobo movies, which were pretty popular, and you could find them in video stores all the time back in the day, and they've had nice reissues by Scream Factory, a lot of them. Those aren't his best movies, but his really gothic movies are pretty good, and he has a couple of good Spanish gialli. So I thought I should check this out since it's so rare that it's not even in. I have 2 different books on the subject, and it's not mentioned in either of them. And I think it appears to me like he was on vacation in Denmark, and someone flew him out to Denmark or drove him out to Denmark to shoot a movie, and he was just there for a vacation. The concept is a decent concept. It's a black comedy where two elderly serial killers, which are Nashi and a guy whose name I didn't write down, but he kind of looks like Zero Mostel. And so he's really hamming it up. Well, Nashi's like the complete opposite, because he doesn't speak English very well. So he's sort of phonetically speaking his lines in English. And they just wander through New Amsterdam trying to one-up each other's body count. And they're not even that. Like, at one point, Nashi strangles a guy in front of we'll just call him the Zero Mostel guy, and looks at him and says, "See, professional." So there's a good idea.
Yeah.
And I imagine if Hammer or Amicus would have made it 15 years prior with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing as droll mass murderers, and maybe sardonic Donald Pleasance as a cop chasing them, because the cops in this have all this drama that it's hard to understand. Their accents are thick. I understand they wanted to shoot in English because it's easier to sell that way. There's one scene where Nashi kills a guy who's just in a random film editing suite, and he nonchalantly sits down and starts the moviola back up and just starts eating the snacks, I guess just because the whole point being that this is very low energy for him. He tries to kill an even more elderly man on a bench, who counters him and says, "You don't recognize me." And it turns out he's an even older serial killer, and they share a hearty handshake. But it's a chore otherwise. It's monotonous. One bloody scene that's not particularly bloody that they replay just to fill time. And I guess, the Zero Mostel looking character has a whole side plot where he's going on a date with a younger woman. It's just not a lot going on here. This is an impossibly obnoxious synth score. It was nothing. It really sort of feels like someone was playing along with the tape as it was running without having planned anything out. But then a pretty cool theme song that's a flamenco guitar song sung by Judith Hirsch, who plays the other killer's love interest throughout the movie. I liked that part. That was pretty much it. If you like the idea of killers in Amsterdam, watch Dick Maas's vastly superior Answer Damned, which came out the same year. Which is very strange. I don't know if someone overheard that they were filming this pretty high budget like police procedural with boat chases and everything, and decided to sneak in and do their version of it to trick people.
It might have been a certain tax law went into effect in 1988, and so
everybody had to get in. Right,
so they were just like, all right, well, let's head to the Netherlands and crank out a movie that we can sell.
Yep. So not worth seeing though, unless you're like a huge Nashi completist. I would not bother.
Yeah, and if you want to see two competing serial killers in a better movie, that's the plot of Kiss the Girls, though it's not revealed till the very end. The James Patterson novel / Morgan Freeman adaptation with Ashley Judd. The next one is Twisted Issues, directed by Charles Pinion. And I talked a little bit on the last episode about, I forget the name of the movie by now, but there's the Australian film that has the sort of the punk ethos, Brain Blast. And I sort of talked about how I associate shot on video horror with a sort of punk aesthetic, and I think a lot of the people who are into it now are more in that world, but also it's just that whole DIY sensibility just runs through all of these movies. And Twisted Issues is actually a punk splatter film. It was billed itself as a psychopunk splatter comedy, and it was sort of shot in Gainesville, Florida. Charles Pinion also did I should have wrote this down, Red Lake something. There was some movie that sort of got rediscovered recently, or at least all the people on my I follow on Letterboxd watched it in the past 2 or 3 years.
Red Spirit Lake.
Yeah, Red Spirit Lake is the other film of his that you might know. And he is more of an art house, more experimental. Twisted Issues I've seen described as being more of a zine than a movie, where it's like just very episodic and it's very scattered and just more about documenting the Gainesville, Florida skate culture than necessarily telling a coherent horror story. So it sounds awesome. I just had no way of watching it, so unfortunately we did not watch that one. The next one is Wood Chipper Massacre from 1988, directed by John McBride. Sounds like it's Don't Tell Moms the Babysitter's Dead, except with a wood chipper.
That's
this
ideal.
This
Sounds
is
better.
something that I this is something I think is notorious for being one of the most like boring horror movies ever. At least this is a movie before I got into SOV. I heard this film's reputation as just being like, oh, that movie's really awful. And I remember, and it stuck with me because like you even hear the title Wood Chipper Massacre and you're like, that doesn't sound too exciting. Like, you can't picture someone running around with a wood chipper. It's just you imagine people putting in pieces
Putting it on wheels
into a wood chipper, and it's just it sounds laborious.
Oh God, I know we're trying to keep this short, but I was told a Kinko's story a couple episodes ago. I actually had a Kinko's story. There was someone who tried to drag his wife into a wood chipper in a murder-suicide in Phoenix when I lived there. And one day, some guy came into Kinko's to make a copy of a wood chipper instruction guide, and I made a really dark, comedic kind of thing. He looked like a guy who would think it was funny, and I said, "This isn't the one where the guy jumped into." And he looked at me dead serious and said, "Yes, it is. And check this out." And he opened the page and he said, "You can only turn it on from the outside. There's no way he killed himself. She killed him." And I was like, "Oh shit!" So that was pretty awesome. I don't know if that's
Everybody's
true,
buzzing
but
about
it
this.
was still pretty rad.
About this Phoenix, Arizona wood chipper massacre.
Yeah. So massacre of one guy and a woman who got kind of hurt, who this guy swears was the actual murderer.
That's funny. The next one is Captives from 1988, directed by Gary Cohen. It's also known as Mama's Home. And Gary Cohen is the guy who did Video Violence. So I really wanted to see Captives. He also did Video Violence 2, which we didn't talk about because we're not doing sequels, but that movie is also just absolutely dreadful. But this movie has a good reputation. It's a pretty standard plot of a group of criminals taking an affluent family hostage in their home and sort of torturing them, but it's very overtly political. It's very, I think probably it's the kind of movie where the characters are name-dropping Reaganomics and things like that.
Right.
And it sounds like this was sort of Gary Cohen's attempt to make a movie that could cross over into some non-horror appeal. It's like, what if I made a movie that you didn't have to be a total mutant to enjoy, like Video Violence? And I don't think that it succeeded because he didn't have, I don't think, really a career after this movie. But unfortunately, it's not available on YouTube or anything because I really wanted to check this out. It sounds cool.
Yeah, I couldn't find it.
The next one is Cannibal Campout from 1988, directed by John McBride and Tom Fisher. And you saw this one.
Yeah, I watched this. This is on YouTube. This was maybe my least favorite of the things I watched because it wasn't bad enough to have that sort of accidental funniness as something like, say, Don't Go in the Woods, which is a shot-on-film slasher that's probably my favorite dumb slasher. And they actually have basically the same plot. But it also doesn't have that weird entertainment value or whatever you want to call it from a couple movies we're actually going to cover in this episode that are like such outsider art that you have to respect them. It's just sort of a mundane, not good movie where some people go out camping and they get attacked by cannibals, very redneck cannibals, more like Deliverance than Chainsaw Massacre, but they do have a family, so I guess there's some Chainsaw Massacre stuff there. It's not scary. The worst part is that the killers are mega obnoxious instead of threatening. They just whine a lot and try to make really unfunny jokes, and that's supposed to be funny, that their jokes aren't funny. It's sort of
Has
like...
that gambit ever worked?
What if...
Writers try it all the time, and is the character who tells bad jokes as a joke, like, does that ever work?
I can't think of an example. Like, it's like, what if you had, like, there's one who doesn't talk who's sort of Leatherface, I guess. He's wearing a jet helmet, and it gets ripped off later, and his face is all messed up. And then the other two are basically bargain basement chop tops. And as the rare person who doesn't actually like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 very much. The shitty version of a character I already don't like is really grating. So the gore effects are pretty good, and so I understand why it has a following, because it is gross. But it makes you appreciate when someone like Joe D'Amato, the Italian director, he has a movie called, which I don't think we talked about, called Anthropophagus, where cannibal rips a baby out of unborn baby out of someone and eats it, and it's very moody and scary and gross. In this case, it's like no mood or scares, and they rip a baby out and eat it, and they make jokes about trying to tell the gender of the baby based on its flavor. Yeah, you're laughing.
That sounds great.
It's not funny.
I'm a Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 fan, so you know what? Maybe this is right up my alley.
It was just, I found it super obnoxious, but the soundtrack was a banger. The soundtrack was a banger. Spooky pianos, pop, kind of like inspirational. There's a part where someone's jogging and they're listening to an original pop track that's really good. And I gets a good use out of all those artificial voice sounds that came with Casio keyboards.
Yeah.
So that part was nice. I guess the soundtrack was good, but I fucking hated it otherwise. Right. I think it might have been my.
I should have checked this one out. I think because it sounds maybe like it's up my alley. You also watched 555 from 1988. Don't get confused. It's the movie 555 from the year 1988, not the other way around. Directed by Wally Koz. What is this movie? Because that title is enigmatic. I don't know what to expect from this movie.
The title's enigmatic, and the box art is this super gnarly image of a guy getting his head chopped off that looks really convincing, and there's spray paint in the background. It just looked like and it was one of those ones that it wasn't necessarily banned in England, but it was definitely like on the lists. So I was very aware of the cover art, and I think it was the first movie I watched for this. It's not terrible. It's okay. I guess I think the way I wanted to describe it, the note I made, is that it feels like community theater mixed, like a community theater version of a cop procedural mixed with a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie. So it's really talky, but in a way that feels natural given the style of performance. And it's sort of charming because none of the actors are like Hollywood good looking. They're all somewhat homely people that they feel like real people. And the way it's blocked out, it's not very well shot, but it's blocked out like a small dinner theater performance. But then there'll be every once in a while a relatively violent scene, including the one that's on the cover that is a very convincing beheading. Basically, characters keep talking about how much there's a killer out, and then it will be two teenagers making out, and then the killer will show up and kill them, and that just kind of keeps happening. It's the other note I made is it's like a local news team got their footage together and they tried to make a hard-boiled cop movie, and they had to use some like homemade softcore porn to pad time, and they found like a gore effects reel, a really convincing gore effects reel too. So none of it really holds. Yeah, gels, but it wasn't bad. And again, a really good score. The title theme I love.
That's a good point that you bring up. I don't think we've really brought this up outside of sort of commenting on what weird fuckers the Polonia brothers are. But like I think even in independent films, I mean especially these days independent, like the word doesn't really have any meaning anymore.
Right.
But like even when you look at low budget movies from the era that aren't shot on video, they still have enough of a budget that they're probably made in a place where they're hiring people who act, if not for a living, then regularly as a side job or something like that.
Yeah, like it's a big hobby for them at the very least.
And you're generally watching, even in low budget independent movies, you're generally watching movies self-selected with a cast that is self-selected from a group of human beings who are probably statistically going to be more attractive than the average person. And when you watch these movies, they really do just look like normal ass people. And especially whenever there's like a romantic subplot or whatever, like the girl who's supposed to be attractive or sexy or whatever, like is more often than not way more normal looking than, and I think that's a big part of the overall aesthetic of SOV that people don't really talk about much in general when they talk about cinema sins, or they talk about the way that Hollywood movies, or the way that in general the movies are kind of false and ring untrue as you watch them. But like, yeah, it's always about hot people. It's always, and it's like when they can't, and it's like when they can't, and when they can't cast, when they're trying to cast someone who's supposed to be like, oh, you're down to earth and normal looking, and you're not particularly attractive, then it's like, oh, you're just a hot person who isn't skinny. Like, like I don't know. We've been watching a lot of Superstore, the sitcom, lately, and like America Ferrera, it's like she's just like, oh yeah, she's just a regular, working at Walmart kind of gal. It's like, no, like she's absolutely beautiful. She's just like not skinny, like.
Yeah, actually, 555 has one woman who's like basically she's a reporter, which will come up again actually in a minute here, a couple minutes here. But she's a reporter who's like sleeping with the cops to get the scoop, and they just keep talking about how this hot chick's not worth it. And I was genuinely charmed that she just kind of looked like a mom, like a 40-year-old.
You
mom.
get this,
and she wasn't even dressed particularly. Like sexy, like they weren't even pushing that. She was just wearing clothes. She does have a sex scene later, but other than that, she's just sort of a regular person. She looks like an honest to God news anchor.
You have to watch regional independent films for that to be the case. Like that's always true in like Romero movies. Everybody looks super normal. Even when he lucks into getting someone like a Ken Foree, or in general, just people are just kind of like, they're just people, they're just dudes. Like they're just weird looking people. So I think that's an important part of the overall SOV aesthetic that probably out of politeness it's maybe not discussed as often.
Right. It's important though. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I imagine that there are videos all over YouTube where guys are making fun of this as an aspect of this bad movie.
No,
that it's so bad, and it also doesn't have attractive people.
No,
that's not what I'm saying. I actually like.
We're all human beings. Like we have all like been attracted to and found sexy people who, if you saw them in a movie, you would be like, that is a perfectly average looking or ugly quote unquote person. No, it's cool. It's like one of the things that's cool about this and it makes it feel less like it's a movie that fell out of the sky from some unattainable like land of blessed people. That's also one of the reasons why when you watch independent movies from LA, it's like never as good, because it's always just people who move to LA because they're the best looking person in their high school. Yeah. And so like it's just like, oh, well, these are just the hot people who are bad at acting. You don't get I watched Mary Jane isn't a virgin anymore last night. And you don't get the I can't remember the name of the actor who plays the lead, but you don't get her in the movies. You just get where it's like, oh, she's actually a really good actor. She just is not conventionally beautiful, and therefore would not have a career in Hollywood. Right. You don't get that in LA independent movies. You just get like, oh, they're beautiful and bad at acting.
Yeah. This actually goes into the next movie. Because I'm looking at the cover and there's an attractive, busty woman who is definitely not in the movie on the box.
I guess. if you want to grab a segue, I guess we could use that one.
I just opened the file as you're saying all these things, and I'm like, who is this woman? I don't. Yeah, the Brainsucker from 1988,
directed by Herb Robbins. So this is a movie that you watched, and you were like, "I need you to watch this. I need another witness."
I thought that you would appreciate,
and I do. Yeah.
It's my note was entirely deranged, absolutely unhinged. It's, to me, it felt like someone set out to make a Buñuel or Paul Bartel movie, and there was a gas leak, and they all got sick and made a Troma movie. But I think this would even be too strange for Troma.
Well, I mean, it's definitely too rough around
not,
the edges. Like, there's a lot of scenes where you hear the director giving direction from behind the camera.
Yes.
Like, it's not quite trash cans of terror in terms of how poorly put together it is, but it is like astonishingly shoddy.
Like especially the first 10 minutes. Like, I was afraid that it was going to be absolutely unwatchable. I guess, can you describe the plot? What is the plot?
So the plot is there are mad scientists who, and I feel like when I was watching this, I recognized the plot from or at least the first moment from an early horror movie from like the 50s or the 40s. But it's basically, there's this drunk who keeps getting in trouble with the law, and his probation, instead of going to jail, is that a mad scientist agrees to take him under their care. But what the law doesn't know is that this mad scientist is going to perform experiments and turn him into a weird brain-dead zombie type. And there's two mad scientists, in fact, and they're warring with each other. And all of this is delivered via like just screeching, screaming dialogue. Especially early on, all the characters are just yelling everything.
It's literally I've seen versions of this on public access television. This sort of like. This, like, they made their Frankenstein lab, and they're just sort of screeching and yelling in horrible accents.
This whole first scene, like, moment, it feels like if you gave a late night horror host even less money somehow. Like, that's what kind of said it would be. And they are screeching at each other, and the one is like, I want to make him all good, and the other's like, I'm going to turn the dial to evil, like it's Simpsons Treehouse of Terror or something. And so what results is this like weird mutant guy who has these sort of lapses of morals where he decides he's going to be evil, and he escapes with an expensive suit. That's an important plot point, is that these scientists are like, we're gonna make you fit you into society, and here's a nice suit, and he goes out on his own, and there's a little bit of being there, like there's a little bit of people just projecting onto him what they want to believe about him because they see his expensive suit, and they're like, oh, well, you must be a man of leisure, you must be, a wealthy man, you must know what you're doing, you must, be a society type. And there's a little bit of that, and then there's like an ongoing thing about this like sort of evangelical megachurch that I don't think goes anywhere. I honestly, this is one of the ones I watched earlier on, and it's so unhinged. It's hard for me to remember all the plot points. But basically, what it struck me as is, have you ever seen like a Nick Zed movie or like Cinema of Transgression? That like New York Underground movies of the late 80s and the early 90s and stuff. A big thing that they really liked to do was they thought it would be funny if they tried to make things seem as cheap and poorly put together as possible. I read a book on Cinema Transgression once, which is the only reason I know this. I'm no expert on actually watching the films or whatever, but they're talking about like, oh yeah, what if we made a movie that was like a jungle safari movie, but we shot it in my living room, and like that sort of thing like was just sort of an amusing trope of those films, and this feels the same way. It has that sort of weird shaggy feeling. It's definitely like it's intentionally funny. It's not like the Carl Sukenik or Nick Millard films where you feel like this is a mentally unstable person behind the camera.
No, this feels like something that people made to entertain themselves, and then it got loose somehow. But
there's also like a sense of ambition. There are scenes in this where like there are like 10 or more extras and stuff like.
It has something to say. It has like a political and social point of view. It's just the satire is so weird and honestly kind of annoying that it's hard to tell exactly what its point is. But there's like a part where because he's wearing the suit, a guy from a bank meets with him on the street and tries to get him to open a credit card account. He ends up going into a motel and asking for their best suite, and as he's describing all the things he wants in the suite, it's getting crazier and crazier, and the bellhop, or whatever you want to call the guy at the front, is basically getting off on this every time he says something more. out of control. And then the actual suite itself is clearly just like a Motel 6 room. And then he opens he basically dubs himself a psychiatrist and starts a business in this hotel room. And women come to him, and he uses this homemade this contraction they think he stole from the mad scientist to literally suck their brains out. And it's not particularly gross or even violent or anything.
This is one of those movies that's like you could barely classify it as horror.
Yeah. And so there's something going on there, and there's something about something. I would like to actually read what the filmmakers have to say about this. If it was really just being weird.
You discovered something about the director.
Did I? I already forgot. What did I discover about the director?
He was an actor. He was I think he's the Carnival Barker in the Funhouse.
Yes, in Funhouse. And he only made one other movie, which is Worm Eaters, which is a movie kind of like this one that's just sort of nonsense and not very funny. This one's funnier just because it's trying to be something weird. The soundtrack's also really weird. Like, it makes it feel even more deranged because there's like avant-garde jazz playing.
Yeah,
there's this kind of punk rockabilly thing, and then there's this just insane title song that's like called the Brainsucker Rap, but it's like what older white people thought rap was.
It's rap and Duke level rap.
Yeah, it's so strange. And yeah, it's a movie that makes you feel like you're maybe having a seizure while you're watching it sometimes.
I mean, I again, like, for me, that's more Alien Beast.
Oh yeah. No. Alien Beast is like an extra tier. This is something that I think people could actually engage with, if they weren't too annoyed by what it's doing, because there's a lot of yelling.
I mean, you said this feels like something was made like for a party that just got loose. And like this is a movie that you could sit down with a group of people and watch, and especially if the people don't know what to expect, it would be kind of fun watching their reaction, because it is really hard to predict where it's going to go next, and you are able to follow it just enough that it's able to keep baffling you as opposed to just checking out completely.
Yeah, and it has zero attention span, so it doesn't really get boring. It just keeps going and
it's
going.
Just exhausting.
The reason
it's not boring. It's just exhausting.
Yeah, it is. I kept on thinking about, and I can't quite connect these, but I kept on thinking about, the reason I said Paul Bartel's, I kept on thinking about Eating Raoul, and then something about the way characters interact kept making me think about Alex Cox's Repo Man and some of his other movies where people just whine at each other. Instead of like set pieces, there'll be people whining at each other. It doesn't really match either of their styles, but it's kind of along those lines. Like, what if someone who wasn't Alex Cox or Paul Bartel tried to do something like this in the 80s? It's interesting. I definitely saw it early enough in this viewing process that it felt like maybe it was important, because I had been watching things that I wasn't enjoying before that.
Fair enough. The next movie is Phantom Brother from 1988, directed by William Zarka. Again, just another slasher movie. I do wonder if it feels like as we get towards the end of the 80s on this list, we're getting more and more slasher movies. Whereas before the video medium was almost seen as too avant-garde to do something as generic as, just crank out a slasher movie and release it for people.
Yeah.
But it does seem like now we're just getting more and more generic slasher movies. I've heard no good things or interesting things about this. Horror comedy is what I've heard it termed as. John Travolta types in the woods. Who could say? The next one is Almohadon de Plumas from 1988 by Ricardo Islas. This is the director of Crowley, which we talked about earlier. So this is another Uruguayan film? Is that...
Yes, seemingly he's not a child anymore. Wasn't he literally a child
in the 4 years in between the two movies?
Yeah.
And I don't know literally anything about it. It's on YouTube, but it's in Spanish with no subtitles, and I couldn't find any reviews of it. So, Night Feeder from 1988, directed by Jim Whitaker. Now you watched this one.
Yeah, this is a very interesting movie. This is maybe another one of my favorites. I'm going to spoil the plot here, because if you look into this movie, the poster spoils it anyway. So this is a movie that tries so hard to do so much that I really liked it, because it's another police procedural, and it's really melodramatic soap opera sometimes. And there's all these breaks for there's a punk band. I can't remember what they're called
The
in the movie, but
Nuns.
in real life, the
In, yeah.
Nuns.
In real life, they're the Nuns.
Yeah, they were called some. I think they're called Disease in the movie. So it's interested in that, and that sort of. They're not really a punk band. Like when I heard Bay Area punk, I was thinking like Operation Ivy and early Rancid. It's really more of a goth pop thing. It was like the end of that sort of new wave era. So it's not like hardcore. It's like it's a little more interesting as far as the music goes. And then it's also a movie about a mutant baby, baby mutated by street drugs that is attacking people at night and sucking their brains out through.
I love it.
So it and you don't find this out until the end. It is implied throughout that the drugs that they're using, that specifically members of the band Disease are actually giving to people, are causing this. But it's the fact that it's a random baby just comes out of nowhere at the end. So I read a lot of reviews saying this 0 stars for the first however long, 5 stars for the last 5 minutes, but I actually thought this was fascinating because the lead protagonist, whose name is Jean, is this idealized feminine fantasy as written by women. And I don't know if I've ever seen that in an 80s horror movie. I've seen a straight man's version of a perfect man. I've seen a straight man's version of an underdog man. And I've seen a straight man's version of a strong woman a final girl. But this is like, this woman is everything. So she's, the note I made is, what if Murphy Brown ended up in a 0 budget movie about a baby killing people? But like, that didn't even work because the whole point of Murphy Brown is a lot of people hate Murphy Brown. But everybody loves Jean. She's a hard-nosed investigative reporter. She's gotten a divorce and she's moved into this underground club. She's a roommate of one of the members of Disease, and she hangs out with these younger people, these goth and punk rockers, and she serves them drinks. She's at the center of the murder investigation because people keep dying on the property around her. She's in a love quadrangle between her ex husband, who's a straight-laced lawyer, the roommate, who's the front man of the band, and then this protective police detective who's pretty close to what you would say a standard like a track. He's kind of like a Robert Davi type. And then she's a sexy older woman, and in this context, older means maybe 40. I don't think she's even that old. But again, it goes back to what we were saying, that more normal looking people appearing in these movies, like it's a different version of attractive, but she's a really good looking woman who's older than most of the other characters. There are a lot of young punk rock people in it. She's an active member in her community. She has a different outfit in every scene. These kids love her, these teens and 20-somethings. The locals all respect her and want to help her with the case when she's looking into it. It's just women want to be her and men want to be with her, and to me that was really fascinating. And so it almost feels like a vanity project for the lead actress, whose name is Kate Alexander. But I looked into it, and assuming I'm correctly gendering the people based on their names, the writers were Shelley Singer and Leanna Dew. And the producer, one of the producers who's not credited as a producer but is part of the company that made this, who is also credited as the editor and art director, is Joanne Gillerman. And it's directed by a man, but it still feels like the only feminine view I saw of shot on video trash, just garbage. And it helps that the lead is actually a decent actor. She'll have these really soap opera scenes where like the video footage look to it, the soft focus, the keyboard sounds. She'll have like just discussions with like how she can't get back together with her husband. And it just feels like it's switching from one movie to another all the time, which I really liked. But it was also atmospheric when it was trying to be scary. The songs by the Nuns were cool. The synth soundtrack was cool, and they had 2 really impressive special effects scenes. One was a autopsy of one of the victims to prove, and they do the thing that they do in Reanimator where they peel his head like a large orange, and cut open the skull cap, and they look inside, and there's no brain, it's just tissue and stuff. And then the mutant baby itself is actually a pretty impressive animatronic. So I felt like there had to be more to this movie. And Christine, actually, while we were watching it, because she watched it with me last night, she did a little bit of research. And Viper Vortex was the name of the production company. It changed its name to Viper Vertex Productions. They were an art group that basically, they worked out of the Bay Area. And this included Joanne Gillerman, who was one of the producers. And they did video art projects. I was thinking that they were videographers or whatever, but they did interactive art projects that would, there was on their website, which is still up, videovertex.com, I believe. Vipervertex.com. They had some of the things. It's kind of outdated, but it looked like it was stuff like it was video that you could go in and it would be an art place and you would talk to it and it could interact with you when you talk to it. Or if you stood on certain lights, it would change what was on the screen. And somehow they ended up, this was the only movie they ever made, and they made a CD-ROM version of it that they sold off their website that I couldn't find any information about other than from their website. And it apparently had interactive sets. You could re-edit the movie to be your favorite scenes. That you could just watch the movie as is on a CD-ROM. There was a full motion video. I guess there might have even been. It sort of implies that there were different versions of scenes. Maybe. I really wish I would have known this and had a way. Like, it seems like these people are really cool, nice people that maybe if I would have emailed them, I could have gotten a copy of it. But I didn't know about it until last night. So this was really fascinating movie that it's been re-released by Bleeding Skull on videotape. I think it could do with a Blu-ray release. It was shot on good enough equipment, and I really enjoyed it. And I do understand why other Letterboxd users thought that the majority of the movie was boring, but I was just really fascinated by its point of view.
And the interactive CD-ROM thing is really funny because I feel watching a lot of these movies that once video stores I think there was the market for these shot on video movies, or just for this scale of production, probably that market shrank a little bit once major studios began releasing their tapes at affordable prices, because then all of a sudden you have like, well, instead of one copy of Batman, we can have 14 copies of Batman, and that's how you eventually get to the Blockbuster point where it's like we have 70 copies of the newest movie, the newest Vin Diesel movie, and we have 0 copies of the independent movie that's interesting. And I feel like a lot of this energy can be found in the interactive CD-ROMs in the computer games of the mid, like
the Sega CD,
CD era, which it began a little bit before that, but Sega CD was like right around the cusp of that, where there was now that computers began to have CD-ROM drives, suddenly they could fit so much more media onto a CD, and they were like, well, 3D graphics are not at the point where it's not like we can fill a whole CD with a vivid 3D world. Like, that was just sort of outside the reach of video games and stuff. But what we could do is just put a whole bunch of video on there, and then there were all of these very thinly veiled, like, lightly interactive quote-unquote games that were really just bad shot-on-video movies that existed in that space.
Yeah, and it's full motion video games, like, I suppose we could have actually included them on this list. There's a lot of that already in the internet sphere and on YouTube. People really care about the full motion video game. I actually watched a whole bunch of them just out of boredom, but Night Trap was a big one that has so beloved all these years on that it actually...
Well, you look back on it now, especially the Sega CD, because Sega CD had such absolutely god-awful resolution and so few colors that, like, the video is absolutely terrible. But, like, when you're comparing it to, like, Sonic the Hedgehog, the idea of a video where there are characters, like, talking to you and stuff was just like, oh my god, this is the future, this is it. And you had legitimately good, interesting game designers like Roberta Williams working in that space with her Phantasmagoria. And I mean, I don't know what
Seventh Guest is
Seventh
another
Guest
one
was
I
a really
remember.
big one, for sure.
There's one that has HR
Oh, really?
stuff, but I don't remember what it's called. That was one of the few actually.
There was a handful of cyberpunk ones as well that were pretty cool.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to play the new cyberpunk game, you should go back and play whatever that game where you're going into the cyber cafe and you're jacking in or whatever. But the CD-ROM, interactive CD-ROM sort of stretch of video game history definitely belongs a place in the conversation of shot on video movies.
Yeah.
The next one is Dinastia Sangrienta from 1988, directed by Luis Quintala Rico. And it translates to Bloody Dynasty. It is a Mexican shot on video movie, and that's all I know about it. The next one is Blind Faith from 1989, directed by Dean Wilson. Not to be confused with a 1990 miniseries based on the true story of the Robert O. Marshall contract killing. Blind Faith, also based on a true story. It's a procedural serial killer investigation, and like a lot of those movies, especially the non-Silence of the Lambs ones, it's very slow and very dry, and mostly just detectives wandering from place to place, being like, Jesus, this guy.
This guy's
This
evil.
guy's
This is
so
fucked up.
bad. Thank God I'm here. Those movies are often very boring. Before,
Yes.
why am I blanking on his name? Director of before Jonathan Demme came along and was like, what if we made them fucking crazy? Next one is Witchfinder from 1989, directed by Gary Whitson. It's one of the earliest Wave productions, and this is the point where we got to talk about Wave for a little bit. Wave was a mail-order movie-on-demand service. My understanding is I think they'd advertise in the back of, if not Fangoria, in the back of, some of the lower rent
Gore
magazines. And basically what you would do is you would send them $500 and your script, and then they would make a movie. And would they shoot your script word for word? No, they would not. But they would make the movie that you wanted them to make. But the nature of this was basically they were just doing on-demand fetish content. Like Wave Productions is basically a forerunner of OnlyFans. So one of the most famous instances of Wave Productions is Eaten Alive, A Tasteful Revenge, which is someone clearly had a vor fetish, and it is a film that's like maybe 27 minutes long, about a woman who keeps getting passed up for a promotion at the science lab she works at. So she takes the science lab shrink ray, shrinks down all of her competition, and eats them. And the special effects are absolutely incredible. Vinegar Syndrome released a Blu-ray of Limbo. Tina Kraus, I think is the name of the filmmaker who made that. But she was in Eaten Alive, and they also contain Eaten Alive on that Blu-ray. And I would say buying that Blu-ray just for Eaten Alive is worth it, because it is fascinating how they, with no money and just the barest of video effects, pull off all of those special effects and stuff. So the Wave is really fascinating history. There was a documentary made about Wave that unfortunately I can't seem to figure out how to watch online anywhere. Because when I found out it existed, I was like, hell yeah, let me rent that. I'm going to pay for that. And I don't even know how to pay for it. But Wave Productions is really fascinating. And this one is a modern day witch hunter killing beautiful female Satanists. And if it's anything like other Wave Productions, at some point the beautiful female Satanists get tied up and gagged.
Of course.
Next movie is Black Pass from 1989, directed by Olaf Ittenbach. Olaf Ittenbach is a big name in this space because he is the German filmmaker who made Burning Moon, which even before I really dipped my toes into the more obscure world of like shot on video horror and stuff, Burning Moon had a certain notoriety as being like when you had web forum conversations about like what's the goriest movie of all time, like Burning Moon is always in there. Burning Moon is like no Evil Dead, nothing. Like you want the real shit, you got to go with Burning Moon. And we'll be talking about Burning Moon in a little bit. but Black Past was sort of Olaf Ittenbach's first crack at it. And the special effects are absolutely incredible, and it is a lot like Evil Dead in plot. A shitty teenager gets a mirror that is haunted, and he starts having nightmares about fucked up shit happening, and then fucked up shit starts happening around him, and there's all of these gags that are stolen from Evil Dead, and the special effects are absolutely incredible. Like Burning Moon, this has a plot where it's just like family just keeps telling a teenager what a piece of shit he is, and he's just like, man, fuck you, and then just gore happens. Ittenbach would go on to just be a special effects guy. Right. He continued to make movies into the digital era, but long after his directing career ended, he was still a guy who did special effects for large scale productions, such as Uwe Boll's Blood Rain. So
yeah,
great pedigree there. But Black Past I like a lot. Black Past, it's paced well, and the gags are really good, and it has a better story than Burning Moon, which Burning Moon is an anthology film, but it's an anthology film with only 2 stories in it, and it's only the second story that really goes where you want it to. Actually, no, there's a lot of good gags in the first story, but it's just more traditional serial killer run amok sort of a thing.
Yeah, this whole thing was the German underground movement is what it's called. Yeah, and so he's one of 3 kind of important characters, with Jorg Butt-Garrett, who did the Necromantic movies, and is the best of these, for sure. And did not shoot on video, as far as I can tell.
No. He made films. In fact, he made kind of beautiful looking movies. Like Der Todesking is like a really evocative and beautiful, almost art film kind of anthology film.
Yeah, and then you got Ittenbach, who's like sort of a craftsman. He's a special effects guy for sure. Who's kind of in between Butt-Garrett and Andreas Schnaz, who is just sort of, he's like the Sam Raimi of the group. He's just in it for the thrills, the young Sam Raimi of the group. And we'll talk about him later too, actually. So I'll save most of his stuff.
Yeah, but
this was all a big deal. This was a big thing to people at the time.
And there's people better qualified than me to sort of look at that era of German film and the German films that came before it or whatever, and like why did Germany get so gross in this specific stretch of the 80s? I don't know. But I love Necromantic and Der Todesking especially, and I think Black Past, I think this movie's good. I think it's a good time. It is available on YouTube if you want to check it out. Though, like a lot of these movies, when you watch them now, what you're watching is a DVD rip. So a lot of these movies, people went back and they re-edited and re-added music and sound effects and all that. Black Past, I think it's all post-sync, so I think literally all of the sound had been redone, in addition to like new title cards and probably tighter editing and stuff like that. So you're not necessarily watching the 1989 Black Past, but I think the Black Past that does exist in that form is it's still very good. And the special effects are so good, it's not like some of these movies where it's like, no, you want everything to kind of feel junky and shitty because that's like where the charm and personality is. Like, this movie feels like someone who is like, I can do these special effects, and I may be only 17 years old, but I want a career in the film industry, so I've put together this reel. Like, that to me is what Black Past feels like. So the more polished presentation doesn't really affect it negatively. The next film is Fatal Images from 1989, directed by Dennis Devine. Now, you watched this one.
Yeah, I actually watched it right after Night Ripper, which is funny because they're both about they're slasher movies surrounding photography, fashion photographers. This one was the lesser of the two, really Spartan, bad sound quality. Most scenes seem to take place in office buildings. It's pretty well edited, though, and it has a kind of cool concept in which a serial killer binds his spirit to a still camera, and then somebody buys the camera, and every time she takes a picture, she's a fashion photographer, she'll take a picture of someone, and then his spirit will appear and kill them. But they don't really have the special effects budget to do any sort of spirit stuff, so it's just sort of a dude in a beard shows up and kills people. they try to do stuff with reflections and shadows and stage smoke. They try, but it's just not. It's not in them to pull it off. So it's not. It's okay. It's an okay side. If I would have rented it back in the day, I think I would have noticed how bad. Like there's it's supposed to have she's supposed to find it in a antique store of some kind, and it's quite literally just an office with tables and some stuff that they are going to pretend is antiques. It's pretty bad from that standpoint, but otherwise I think I might have confused it with a regular slasher movie had I seen it back in the day on VHS when I couldn't tell the difference between the image quality. That's pretty much all there is to
Which
it.
back in the day it was a lot harder to tell because you're watching movies shot on film on VHS. So the next film is Las Vegas Bloodbath from 1989, directed by David Schwartz. A man is cheated on and he kills his wife and her lover, and then he just kind of goes on a misogynist killing spree. This movie notable because there's just a long stretch in the middle of it where nothing happens. And they have a baby shower, but it's like a baby shower where all the attendees are like trying on bikinis and oil wrestling. So it's that kind of movie, I guess. It's like if you want to get a porno, but you're afraid to get a porno, you get Las Vegas Bloodbath, and then you enjoy the oil wrestling, I suppose. The next film is Satan's Storybook from 1989, directed by Michael Ryder. It's an anthology film starring porn star Ginger Lynn. The framing device is sort of the star of the show here. The framing device is this sort of elaborate dark fantasy thing where this warrior dies and he goes to hell, and then inside of hell there's Satan, who is this man in a very good sort of goat makeup effect. I think they definitely got a real special effects person to do it. I didn't watch the whole movie, but I did hear about this framing device, so I wanted to watch at least the first 10 minutes or so. And it is like long. It's about 15 minutes before you get to the first story. So it's one of those. There's a couple of anthology shot on video horror movies where you can tell that the framing device was not well thought out, because there's just sort of like, it's just too involved, and it's like way too late in the movie you realize that it's an anthology. It's very strange. So Satan's Storybook at least has a very good goat Satan who's being told stories by his sort of death jester, which is a great phrase as well, death jester. Next is Scream Dream from 1989, directed by Donald Farmer. This is a female singer of a band is possessed by a demon, and she likes to kill men and that she has sex with on tour. I've heard this compared a lot to Demon Queen, the Succubus movie that he made years earlier that we've already talked about. It's Donald Farmer, so I think it's like tits and gore, basically.
Tits, gore, and then boring stuff in between.
I think Demon Queen has more of a following than Scream Dream, but unfortunately I didn't get to see either. Sleepover Massacre from 1989, directed by Gary Whitson. It's another wave production thing. You might think it's a typical slasher, but is in fact about a killer vampire. But it's a wave production, so you can guess there's some sort of fetishy thing in there somewhere. The next one I'm very excited to talk about, the McPherson tape from 1989, directed by Dean Alioto. It's also known as Alien Abduction. It's a found footage shot on video horror movie, which is absolutely wild because the whole thing about these movies is that they're shot on a format that you associate with home movies and stuff like that. It's not the first found footage movie. It's not the first mockumentary or anything like that. But it is, I think, the only found footage movie of the analog video era.
The closest thing is that I can think of that we watched was Video Violence, which has movies.
Yeah, absolutely. There's moments of video violence that, again, is playing with reality in a slightly different way. So McPherson tape also got notoriety because it was remade for TV in the late 90s during when X-Files was sort of at its peak, and you could just get 100 TV specials about UFOs made.
Right.
Basically, Dean Alioto was contacted and were like, "Hey, would you like to remake this movie?" I forget the. I think it's like Incident at Something Lake or something like that is the is the remake version, which when I first heard about this movie, I'm like, oh, I already saw that because I saw it was on TV. And no, I saw the remake version that was shot digitally, so it doesn't count. But it is a movie that had some notoriety because it is just such a strange thing. Because shot on, in the pre-Blair Witch era, a full 10 years before Blair Witch, in fact, there just weren't that many found footage movies. And even the idea of like what a found footage movie was hadn't really taken shape. Even if you go back to Cannibal Holocaust, there's long stretches of that movie that aren't found footage.
Yeah, it's like half at most.
So
found footage.
This is a found footage movie in the way that when you think of the 100 million found footage movies that are cranked out to Amazon Prime every day, like this is that. There's some text at the beginning, there's end credits, and then other than that, it's sort of all purported to be one mostly uninterrupted shot. And so this is a movie that, on the one hand, this has all the downsides of found footage, where it's like, why would the character be holding the camera? That's dumb. And it's all improvised acting with non-actors, so a lot of the improvisation is bad. There's like one character who twice says something that is that almost sounds knowing about like, oh, but this isn't real right now. We're making a movie, and then another character will quickly ad-lib something to be like, what are you talking about? This isn't a movie. I think the joke is like they're at the dinner table. It's someone's birthday party. They're at the dinner table, and this one married couple is like kissing, and he's like, hey, I'm not making a porno here. And then they're like, what are you talking about? You're not making a movie at all. Like, there's like moments like that where it's like, okay, not all the actors are necessarily on the same page. There weren't a ton of rehearsals going on. There's one of the older brother character is sort of on a different tonal wavelength, but some of the actors are really good. There is a lot of really good naturalism, and it is very patient. And for me, I really love found footage movies specifically because I like the mundanity that they can capture. I sort of just like naturalistic mundanity. I think a lot of good slasher movies are the same way, where it's just like teenagers hanging out and improvising jokes to each other and stuff. And so there is a lot of this that's like, oh yeah, this is that good found footage feeling I feel. Even though some of it is kind of hinky, I think the guy holding the camera, who is the director of the film, is not very good. He's kind of the worst actor, and he's kind of irritating. There's this whole antagonistic relationship he has with his older brother that's just gets very obnoxious. Also, the special effects are terrible. The aliens, it's an alien abduction movie, and the aliens are clearly just little kids in costumes. But there is something about this movie that I found so overwhelming and so incredible, and I think it is this. This is a movie that spoke to me as a person who has lived through the year 2020, who has lived through a year of being inside with COVID. This whole movie takes place on this mountain, and they're like in this very secluded house on this mountain. So there's no street lights all around. Like when they look out the window, it's pure blackness. And so there is this like really great natural aesthetic, this kind of claustrophobic feeling. The power goes out as a result of the aliens landing. So there's candles lit everywhere. So everything's kind of eerie looking. And there is this long stretch where they are walking to go see, I forget why they're going out into the woods where they encounter the aliens, but they're going out to it. And it is like 9 straight minutes of an uninterrupted shot where the camera has a little light in front of it, but just barely, and it's mostly on the ground, like it's just someone holding the camera, not pointing it, not directing it. And it's just people talking, and everything, there's this total inky blackness all around them, and they're still walking, and it's one interrupted shot, so you get this sense of geographical displacement of like, it just sort of catches, or at least it caught my breath, where I'm just like, wow, I don't know where they are right now. Like, they're so far gone. Like, they feel so trapped and isolated from everybody else. So like, that's a very natural, obvious horror movie thing. It's just like a setting where people are isolated from, and there's danger around them and they can't go get help. But like aesthetically, this movie accomplishes that in a really wild way, and it's just because of the limitations. And then there's another thing, which is this all happens during a birthday party. Power goes out. They have an encounter with a UFO. They go to investigate it. Then they see aliens getting out of the spaceship. And the special effects and costumes are terrible, but it's a found footage thing. So it's a camcorder shot from 100, from 200 feet away, and it runs away quickly. So it works mostly. They go back to the house and tell everyone at the birthday party, oh my God, they're like freaking out. One of them goes, grabs a gun. And then the other family is just, the rest of the family, they're not really believing them. And there's this really cool, credible stretch of the movie where they're just operating on different wavelengths. And even the people who encountered the aliens are kind of like, look, like, let's forget it. And that keeps continuing to a point where it strains credulity, except that because I was already associating this movie with isolation, with being stuck inside, with sort of the feeling of the outdoors just being inherently hostile, and like nowadays I can't go out without wearing a mask, so just because like even just in my apartment building I can't risk going through the hallways and encountering a fellow tenant and not wearing a mask. So like that feeling was really strong as I was watching this movie. And then there was this sort of ongoing recursive denial where like at a certain point there is an alien corpse in the bedroom. Like things escalate to that point, and then the grandmother of the family is still like, well, let's just sit down, let's finish having the birthday, there's nothing we can do about it. So, and it's like they're trying to go on with their lives when this totally reality shattering event has happened, and like someone is missing, and like things have gone so fucking bad, and it is so scary. And they're just sort of like trying to talk as if like it's okay, we're all gonna be fine. And like again, it's a very much a 2020 thing. This movie became so overwhelmingly emotional to me that I could really excuse the fact that a lot of the acting is terrible and that the special effects are bad, and that there's like a final shot that would be haunting if the special effects were good. Like it's staged correctly, it's shot like the framing of everything is just like, yeah, that's exactly how you do this final shot. Except the aliens come in and they just look like little kids, and you're like, okay, whatever. But like, I thought this movie was so cool and so scary. And honestly, like, I like found footage, and I really like found footage movies that explore their ideas aesthetically. Movies like Unfriended or Blair Witch Project does that, where as Heather sort of begins to lose her grip, lose her sanity, the camera work starts to devolve, and there's like long stretches of Blair Witch Project towards the end where the camera's just pointed at her feet because she's like she's just holding on to the camera as like a safety blanket. She's not trying to make a movie anymore. And like I really like found footage when it's able to take the compelling aesthetic that is found footage and do something visually with it. And it's kind of why I end up hating most found footage movies, is because they start there and then at the end they have to cheat in order to get the scary face to pop up and go boo. And then, or it's like, oh yeah, they're shooting this on a camcorder because it's an 80s set found footage movie, and you're looking at it and you're like, this resolution. Like, for anyone who's seen Paranormal Activity 3 and then goes and watch one of these SOV movies, you're like, no, that's not a camcorder, shut up. What home camcorder is in 16:9? Go to hell. So like, I really think McPherson Tape is one of the best shot on video horror movies I saw, and it's one of the scariest. But like, it happened to work on me in a very particular way, and there were things that I might have found laughable if I'd seen them even a couple years ago, that now I watch it and I go, wow, this is stunning. So I can't necessarily recommend it to everyone as like, this is secretly as great as the Blair Witch Project or anything, but it really worked on me. The next one is Violent Shit from 1989, directed by Andreas Snoz, which we talked about this sort of West German splatterpunk sort of movement. Violent Shit has less justification than most movies, right? Like, this movie is literally just a string of gore effects. It's just
a goof. It's like the killer is the butcher shitter is the name of the killer, and it's I saw it so long ago that I can't actually. It has 2 sequels. I can't remember which is which at this point, but they're all like, they get progressively bigger budgeted, but yeah, they're all.
So the thing that
it's just a lark.
The thing that impressed me about the filmmaker who did Necromantic and then all of Ittenbach, that there is a sort of sensibility to those. There is a personality to those movies. Olaf Ittenbach, you really get a feel for like, oh yeah, this is like some dirtbag like punk teenager who who just feels out of place in the world, and he just looks at the world around him in the way that a lot of teenagers do, and just like, oh, this sucks. Everyone's so phony and fake, and everyone wants me to be happy, and there's no reason to be happy, like that sort of thing. You like that all comes across, and then the director of Necromantic is perhaps even more cynical.
Yeah, and Necromantic, all Butgert's movies are
right.
about depression. Really.
Is Violent Shit have any of that, or is it just empty?
No, it's just goof. It's just a goof. And yeah, it's a guy who knows how to do some special effects. And it's like, you could say any of these German underground things are an acquired taste, and this is a totally different acquired taste to Butger and Ittenbach. And it's he got better as he went along. So if you want to watch, we'll talk about another one of his movies in a minute here. If you want to watch just a goof, I would skip Violent Shit myself.
The next one is, speaking of tons of gore, Zombie Rampage from 1989, directed by Todd Sheets. Kansas City, shot a video horror movie, and it's just a bunch of disconnected scenes where crazy gory shit happens.
Yeah.
I wish I'd been able to see a Todd Sheets movie before we started recording. Unfortunately, I was not, because he is one of the more prolific filmmakers who, to this day, is still making these movies. But unfortunately, I didn't get to see it, so I can't really speak to Zombie Rampage more than that. I did get to see Redneck Zombies from 1989, directed by, and I half suspect this is a fake name just because it's so strange, but it might be his real name, Pericles Lunes. Lewnes. Redneck Zombies is one of the first shot-on-video movies I ever knew about because of that bmovies.org website I talked about on the previous episode. It was released by Troma, so it had some reach as far as video stores and stuff go. It is a horror comedy. It's a lot of really broad, really terrible comedy of people doing really unconvincing Southern accents. So it's not even like a movie made in the South where people are playing up the Southernness. It's just like totally phony. There is a really good joke early on where they buy tobacco from the tobacco man, and it's like a man it's a man in a like ice cream truck, except he sells chewing tobacco, and he is like the Elephant Man. He has the hood over his face, like John Merrick at the beginning of David Lynch's movie, and he has this super long speech about the effects of chewing tobacco and like the physical deformities that will come from it, and like what it's doing to your bloodstream and everything. And it's just this slow zoom on him as he gives this long ass speech about the day, and it's like clear that it's like, oh, this is like a deformed guy who, you know, lost his jaw or whatever from chewing tobacco giving this speech. And then it just sort of cuts to like one of the hillbillies or whatever being like, all right, well, I'll take two. But that's definitely the funniest bit for me. The gore is really good. This is one of those movies where you watch it and you're just like, God damn, like, turns out you can do a lot with a little in terms of gore if you're not trying to be too ambitious about the effects, you know? Like, if you're trying to pull off Day of the Dead shit, then you really need like K&B and Tom Savini and stuff to figure out like, okay, how do we get the tendons in this guy's neck to stretch or whatever. But if you really just want to like dig into someone's stomach and then rip out a bunch of intestines, like, it's really effective every time.
Yeah.
This has another weird thing where it is this like super goofy horror comedy that's really not funny, but then also it's just tries to be like really intense and upsetting and like offensive. Or just there's just sections of it that are just like, isn't this fucked up? Like they're going to sell their moonshine. The thing that makes all the zombies is that they have a toxic waste barrel that they turn into a moonshine still. And then that turns everybody in town to zombies because everyone in town drinks this moonshine. And they're going to sell moonshine to this couple. And then there's just like this girl who's tied up with a gag in her mouth. Like she's part of some different horror movie. Like there's some other redneck horror movie happening off of the sidelines that this guy happened to wander into. And there's footage of some sort of chicken processing plant where it's like these baby chicks and they're going through this machine and it looks torturous, and I don't know what product is being manufactured from this. I don't know what product you make from baby chickens. I don't think that's really a thing, but it's just like really upsetting sort of factory farm footage cut back and forth between that and like this girl's like screaming face, is, she has like duct tape over her mouth or whatever, and it's this kind of thing that would be effective and scary in a movie that wasn't so dumb, like just so aggressively dumb. It just tries to have it both ways, and as a result, it can't do either. It's another one of those movies also where like the opening scene, someone's reading a Fangoria, so you're like, okay, I get it. You're just some shitty kid. Okay, that's fine, cool. Redneck Zombies, can't really recommend unless you're seeing it with a group of people. And
it's one of a couple movies that Lloyd Kaufman refers to as the worst thing Troma ever
Lloyd
put
Kaufman,
out.
it's funny talking about Sean and Video movies, because Lloyd Kaufman has made his share of absolutely terrible films. But Lloyd Kaufman always had a thing about videotape. He fucking hated it. Obviously, eventually that's where the way the world went, and he had to stop making movies on film. But I think, like, even as late as Poultrygeist, he was shooting on 35 millimeter. And despite the fact that Troma released some of these movies, Lloyd Kaufman really, really hated the texture and the resolution of videotape.
They bring it up in that documentary about him, Shoot Your Own Movie, I think it's called. And he says that it was basically sent to them by the filmmakers, and that they were so impressed by their gusto that they decided to release it.
I mean, I'm sure Troma did very well. Troma has made a lot of money by not paying people for their labor.
I saw this was on the shelf at Blockbuster.
Yeah.
I'm not even kidding. I thought about renting it a couple times because it was just sitting there on the shelf. No, at Hollywood. I should say Hollywood Video. Slightly more subversive than Blockbuster, I guess.
Hollywood Video is slightly
difference.
more willing to carry unrated movies. Next movie is Pieces of Darkness from 1989, directed by George Manilla and J. Johnson Jr. III, which is a fucking wild name. Are you junior, or are you the third, or are you the third junior? Is J. Johnson Jr. the third really J. Johnson Jr. J. Johnson the sixth? That's what I want to know. It's an anthology movie. It's another one. One of the stories, two Vietnam soldiers kind of go mad and kill each other. One of them, there's a pair of butcher brothers, and there's an accidental killing there. I think the idea of Pieces of Darkness is that it's like, these aren't necessarily supernatural. These are about the darkness of the human soul and about people turning on each other and stuff. So, one of these, an actor kills his friend for a part, and then he gets his comeuppance. It doesn't have a very good reputation, so we will stop talking about it. Next is Houseboat Horror from 1989, directed by Kendall Flanagan. Another Australian film. It's a slasher about a killer stalking a music video crew as they are sort of stationed on a houseboat. It's slow-paced, is its reputation, but it was really rare, and I think it was sort of notorious for a while just because so few people had seen it that a reputation grew around it that maybe it didn't deserve.
I wonder if they threw it together really quickly. Dead Calm is a thriller with Nicole Kidman and Sam Neill that takes place mostly on a houseboat that was made in Australia and was a really big hit. That also
that
came
was
out
also
in
1989?
I wonder, because Houseboat Horror is a terrible title. I would not want to see that. I would call it the music video horror or something. So I'm wondering if they actually were trying to cash in on Dead Calm at some point.
Possible. I mean, that's, when we talk about mockbusters like Asylum, Transmorphers, I think was the first mainstream one that everyone noticed. But like no budget filmmakers have been doing that for a long time. So it's possible that Houseboat Horror is an example of that. We also have Nutsoids at Cannibal Cove from 1989, directed by Louis Farrell. It's a 30-minute short film. It's a spoof. It's released by Carlson International, the same company that released that 38-minute version of New York's Centerfold Massacre that we talked about back in, I think, episode 1. So again, another mail-order film that you get, and it's 30 minutes long, and it's a spoof horror movie. Whew. I did actually get to watch Heavy Metal Massacre from 1989, directed by Stephen DeFalco and Ron Ottaviano. It is extremely boring. Stephen DeFalco, I think he doesn't play the lead. His brother plays the lead. This is the very first movie I watched in preparation for this, so the details are a little fuzzy. But basically, it's a hair metal guy, and you listen to the absolute worst butt rock you've ever heard in your life. Like, just absolute, like, yes, please, Nirvana, come along and kill this dead because we can't stand this anymore, hair metal. And the thing that is most notable about this, other than it being, like, about, like, I'm a sexy rock guy, and look at me hooking up with girls and tying them up, and then I murder them in a very bloodless scene that sucks after, like, 15 minutes of them being tied up. So it's like this weird vanity thing. But the other notable thing is that it's got like so many video toaster effects. I forget, what was the program you said you knew of? Video popcorn, video toaster,
popcorn, but
like
yeah,
all of those
popcorn,
effects all over the place,
toaster.
whether it makes sense for the scene or not. So clearly this was just a boring movie that they had to stretch out to feature length by any means necessary. And it's just the typical structure of this guy's wandering around listlessly killing people, and then we have police detectives being like, my God, I think he's a killer who's killing people. And then the very like last 45 seconds of the movie, they rush in and shoot him or something like that. So, no good Heavy Metal Massacre. Terrorize from 1989, directed by Eric Parkinson, Michael Rissi, and Steve Sommers. I also watched. This is another anthology film. Now, when it's an anthology film that is shot by as many different directors as there are segments, I always think that the anthology came later in post, and that is definitely the case here because there's stretches of this that I'm not sure if they're shot on video or not. I think the framing device is shot on video. I think the first story is not shot on video. I think the last story is shot on video. It's hard for me to tell because it's all with different equipment, different sensibilities. This is another movie like Satan's Storybook, where the framing device is needlessly convoluted, where there's a monster who comes in from the streets of LA and starts stalking this woman around her office as she's reading scripts. And then she wakes up and it was all a nightmare. But was it? And then it goes back to that segment at a certain point. Like, I guess she falls asleep again, but then she goes on a camping trip, and on that camping trip, then they start to tell the stories that are the other two stories. After one of her boyfriend gets possessed by a demon when he goes out to pee, and he's this wild-looking red-faced demon that's just shouting at people. The look of this movie is absolutely great. It's this crazy, like, a lot of neon light and smoke machines and flash pots, just like a lot of like the demon showing his power, then poof, 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 like little smoke bombs going off and stuff. I think it just looks cool as hell. The first story is extremely boring. The second story is only slightly less boring. First story is like, this book says what we're going to do. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. What does it say? Well, it says we're going to die. But like, just stretched out way too long. The other one's like, I'm a degenerate gambler and I have to do something in order to pay my bookie. And then that something turns out to be a horror thing. And so it's like not a horror thing until the very last couple minutes. Also boring. The final story, which I think is either it's the only one that's shot on video or it's not shot on video. It's hard for me to tell. I think it's shot on a different type of video camera. It feels more like Tales from the Dark Side than a camcorder. It's about this woman who is sort of taking this video game company to task because they make basically predecessor to Grand Theft Auto, where it's like you run around the streets and you murder and rape people. And she's like, these games are super offensive to women and they're terrible and people should stop making them. And then she gets sort of abducted and taken to this mansion where the guy who runs the game company's like, well, I'm going to play a game with you. And she finds herself stuck in basically a live action version of a computer game. She's LARPing, basically, where she has to like, it's kind of like Saw, where she has to solve these riddles and puzzles and everything.
Oh my God, my cat is purring right in.
She loves it. Your cat loves it.
Yeah,
loves Terrorize.
I'm sorry.
Absolutely. I want more high concept sci-fi horror is what your cat says. So this segment's really cool. Like, I think all the like rooms and everything are cool. The estate that they sort of run around and do their thing on feels appropriate. It feels like sort of the mansion that Sleuth takes place in or Knives Out. Like, it has that sort of game feel to it. Right. And then in the end, she sort of like outsmarts him. There's like machine gun turrets and stuff, so it's a little kooky, but like it takes itself seriously enough to work. So I think sort of the overall aesthetic of this movie and that final story is enough for me to recommend it, even though, again, I watch it and I'm like, I don't know how much video this is. I think that first story is not on video, but it's hard for me to tell. Anyway, Terrorize, it is available on YouTube if you want to check it out.
Not to be confused, both Night School from 81 and The Final Terror from 83 were both called Terrorize in Germany, which is weird because then the pun doesn't
Oh, it's so bad. I didn't
But-
realize it was a pun until like the credits rolled and I saw terrorize written out at the on the end credits and I was like, "Oh, you assholes! Why'd you do? It's terrible." We've been saying terrorize, but if you haven't seen it spelled out, it's TERROR space EYES. So your eyes are terror or whatever. It's a bad pun.
Only death is our savior. Suicide our only grace. Somehow we fell out of favor. Somebody's gonna take our place.